Hello, my name's John. These are some of my Dark Angels, this is a compilation video, and you're watching Wargames, Models, and Other Hobbies. Hello and welcome to another video. Something slightly different today. I've decided to do a compilation video of the processes I use to start painting my Dark Angels. As you can see here, I have Lionel Johnson in the green livery of the Dark Angels, as well as a Ravenwing conversion, and then some Intercessor Space Marines painted up as Dark Angels. The following videos are going to cover how I paint the green armour of the Dark Angels, as well as some of the belt pouches, how I apply any transfers to them, and the bases. A few things that aren't in the video include how I paint the weapons, but this is quite simple because it is two colours with a wash of Nuln Oil. So in this case, lead belcher for all of the metal work, and then a red wash of Nuln Oil, but you can use any colour for that you want. At the end of the video going through the process of painting the Dark Angel armour, I've added a bonus video of how I converted my Ravenwing Outrider. I really do like this model. I think I'm going to have to make a few more. And in that video it goes through the whole conversion process, and then I talk about how I painted it up. So for now, we're going to go back in time to me from the past, talking about how I did all of this. Hello and welcome to the video. Now, I'm going to be taking a look at how I painted certain parts of my Lionel Johnson model. What I'm going to be doing is a few little videos on how I painted certain sections of it. The first bit that I'm going to be looking at is how I painted the green armour on this model. So it's going to be the same green that I used for my Dark Angel army that I'm going to paint for 10th edition. So let's get started and have a look at the process that I use. So I have here an Intercessor squad that is painted with all of the stages for the green that I work with. What I'll be doing, I'll run through each of the processes, then I'm actually going to paint each of the processes on the models just so you can see what I actually do. So to start with, the first thing that I do, which we have with this model, is I prime them with the White Scar spray. The next thing that I do is I paint the models with, in this case, a Bal Red, but you could use any ink wash for this process. I then use the Dark Angels green contrast paint on the model. I then do a dry brush of Moot Green, and to finish the green armour I do a wash of Nuln Oil. So let's get started with this model just here, and I'm going to paint it with the Bal Red. Now the reason why I paint this with an ink first, I've done it with a few of the contrast paints that I've used. I use an opposite colour from the colour wheel to help gain some nice contrast on some of the details within there. So where we have more of the red build up, we get a darker contrast with the contrast paint. Now I've previously done it on a Flesh Tearer that I painted with a green wash first before going in with the red contrast paint, and it worked really well. Now this first process that I do, I'm not too worried about being tidy with this. I just want to get this red wash onto the model so it'll highlight the different areas, and then I can get on with the next stages. It's only the final stages of the paint I tend to be tidy with. The first ones, I just throw the paint on. So Let me finish this off and we'll go on to the next stage. Okay, so there we have it, a wash of the Bal Red. Like I said, it could be any red wash that you want to put on there. It doesn't have to be the Bal Red, but my personal preference is this one. Now, while that one dries, let's have a look at the one I'd previously done. So the reason, let's just get this into focus. There we go. So the reason why I like to paint this contrasting colour before I put the contrast paint on is I personally like the surface it creates to put that contrast paint on. I like the depth that it gives the contrast paint. This is an optional process. You don't necessarily have to, but like I said, I prefer to do this. So once I've got to this stage and it's dried, the next step, let me just put that on that one, is to paint with the contrast paint. So in this case, I'm using the Dark Angels green. So what I want to do with this is paint all of the sections I've painted red with the contrast paint, and I want to put plenty of it on to let it do its thing. Now the contrast paints are really interesting because they're a high pigment paint, but they also have a clear or slightly pigmented base to them. It allows the colours to kind of, the heavier colours, the pigment to flow into certain areas of the model, and the thinner, almost transparent base starts to come out on the kind of the higher points, which gives you that contrast finish. But as I said, with the earlier stage, you don't have to really worry about that red layer if you don't want to, but I prefer it. I prefer the way that the contrast paint goes onto it. I've done it with a green ink, green wash, and then a red contrast paint. I do want to try it with a few other contrast paints just to see the different effects that it has. I'm not necessarily sure if it will work with a yellow contrast paint due to the fact that it will be a blue or a turquoise that you paint on to get that higher contrast. So I'm not sure if that would necessarily work. It might come out with slight green highlights rather than the yellow. So it's something that I will try in the future though. But anyway, enough of me babbling on. What I'm going to do is carry on painting this contrast paint. So there is the contrast paint on the model. Contrast paint can take a while to dry, so you really want to let it sit now for quite a while before you put the next stage on. What you may find, if you do it too early, the contrast paint can peel off a little bit. So this one's now going to go to one side, and we'll get to the one that I did earlier. So here we have this one that has already been painted with the contrast paint. And the next step is to do a dry brush of moot green. So the key thing with the dry brush, especially with this stage, because it's the whole model, I'm going to use quite a big dry brush. I'm only going to use a small amount of paint on the brush itself, and then I'm going to knock most of that paint off. Okay, so there we have the dry brush layer over the whole model. Now, you could leave it at this point. I prefer my Dark Angel's green to be slightly darker than this, which is why I do the next stage. It also picks out a few details. But if you wanted to make this green lighter, you could do extra dry brush coats to bring it lighter and lighter, either with different greens or still the moot green. You could then paint salamander armour or something similar like that. So the next step in this, so we have our other dry brush model here, is using Nuln Oil to paint over the armour itself to darken it off and give a few more lowlights in certain areas. So again, with this layer, I'm not too worried about tidiness. I want to paint over the whole model itself rather than just picking out details. The whole point of this method that I use is to get the bulk colour done as rapidly as possible. So I can get lots of models base coated and the simple base colours done very quickly, whether it's the greens or it's other colours altogether. So as you can see as well, I'm not being precious about where I'm painting. I just want to get this ink, this wash, onto the model itself. So that's the legs done. So let me quickly finish this off and we'll have a look at the final one. So there we have that quick wash over the top done. Gonna have to let that dry now. So let's have a look at the one that I'd done previously. This one just here. So as you can see, it makes that armour a lot darker, but we still have the highlights from the dry brushing and the core colour through from that contrast paint. But yeah, there we have it, the Dark Angel's green. Now there are many methods to paint miniatures. This is just a method that I personally use and I really like how it turns out. In this little tutorial, I'm going to be running through how I paint holsters and belt pouches on Space Marines in 5 steps. If we have a quick look at the final outcome. So you'll see the ones that I'm painting at the moment are on my Dark Angel's Intercessor squad. I go for quite a dark finish on these, but I'll talk about the different colours you can use as I go through the process. So starting at the beginning, so to start with, I paint the holsters and the pouches with Rhinox hide. If you want to change the overall colour of the holster, this is when you use a different base coat. If you want it lighter, go for a lighter brown and so on. But for now, I'm going to go with the Rhinox hide. The next step is dry brushing with Rakarth Flesh. So I'll do that straight away on this first one. And this dry brushing can be any lighter brown. I like the really light contrast that this gives to the darker Rhinox hide, but you can use pretty much whatever you want. And the key thing with this, I'm not worried about getting it too accurate. I just want to get this dry brush on so it highlights and looks like a little bit of wear and tear on there. So once I've done that dry brush, clean my brush. The next step, if we have a look at this one, is to give the whole of the belt pouches and the holsters a wash of Agrax Earthshade. So this adds a little bit of depth to the pouches and so on. And it doesn't matter if you use too much at this stage. It will fill in any bits of any areas that you've missed for any paint or anything like that. So you end up with more depth to... Okay, just focus that, and you get a bit more depth to the colour and so on. So what I really like to do is go for a bit of a kind of a wear and tear look without having to weather it afterwards. So the key thing that I'm going to do, I'm going to make sure I put this down to dry on its side there, so the paint dries evenly, it doesn't run to one edge and so on. Let's have a look at the next stage. So once we've given it a wash, we're going to use, in this case, some lead belcher to highlight any of the buttons or other details on these belt pouches. If I just go to this last one, you'll also see we do any handles of any weapons, but again, you can do those the colours that the rest of your weapons are. I tend to do mine with the lead belcher. So let's get this onto this one. So this one doesn't have a holster, it's just got pouches. So what I want to carefully try and do is just get it on the buttons. Doesn't come off as clearly on camera as I'd like it to. Don't worry if you do what I've just done by going over the edges. I'll show you how you fix that. So you might find if you've got a bit of a wobbly hand or your brush isn't small enough, like I've done on this one and this one, we've gone over the edges slightly. Don't worry if that happens. I'm going to show you how we fix that. So for that we go back to our original colour and we're going to paint around the edges of where we've run over just with this. It adds more depth as we're painting, so areas that either don't look as weathered and so on like that. Let's stand that one up now. So all I'm going to do is just run up to the edge with that. There we go. So I've now just got those buttons, the clasps painted. And now we're at the final stage. So if we look at this final one, what I've done is I've given the whole thing a wash of Nuln Oil. So with this one, we've already done all the stages. We're going to paint over those sections with Nuln Oil. So I use quite a bit on this. I don't worry about using a small amount. The whole point of this is just to cover the whole of the area with that Nuln Oil. So it will go into all of the lower areas in there. It will give us a little bit more depth. And then this belt detail as well of the little Dark Angel's emblem, I'm going to paint as well. Okay, and then the next step is just to let that dry. I'm going to lay it down just like that for now so it dries evenly. And at that stage, that's it, you're done. You can add other dry brushing layers, other wash layers, ink layers, that kind of thing. But simply for playing, I just do that nice simple 5 paint technique to get that final finish. In this video, I'm going to be running through the process of applying transfers to miniatures. In this case, it's 2 transfers, one on top of each other, to finally get to this stage. Get it in focus. There we go. This stage of the shoulder pad with a battle line marking and a squad number. I have each of the different stages that I go through just here. First thing to do is you get your transfers and cut them out, which I've already done. We've got that just here on this little acrylic disc. Let's just move those ones out of the way first. So what I want to do is apply the transfer to this shoulder pad. So the first things first, what I want to do is get the transfer soaking. I tend to prefer putting it on a piece of acrylic like this, or a dish, and rather than there being water already in it, just to reduce the risk of any spillage or anything, I put water on it like that. So it's now starting to soak off the paper. The next thing that I use is a clear matte varnish. Let me just give that a shake. Really important with the clear matte varnish to make sure you shake it up. The one I'm currently using is a Humbrol clear matte varnish. And the first thing that I want to do with this is I just want to put a small bit of varnish where I'm going to be applying this transfer. Now that went on a little bit too much, so I'm just going to knock that back slightly. So I do this at a variety of different stages, whether it's during the painting process because I want to paint over the transfer, or it's at the end of the process. It doesn't really matter, the same principle applies. So that matte varnish has gone on, and by now you'll see that that transfer is moving off the paper. So I'm going to just move it off with my brush. There we go. And then apply it to my brush like this. And while this matte varnish is still wet, I'm going to apply this transfer. Now, take as long as you need to position this. So now that's roughly in place, what I want to do, just drying my brush on this paper a little bit, and I'm pulling some of the moisture away, as well as any residual varnish around the edge of that transfer. So you can see now it's on there. It's still quite shiny because that varnish is drying, but what I do at this stage as well is I get a little bit more varnish onto my brush and I paint that over the top of the transfer, and then I'll set this aside to dry. So at this point I've got my next miniature. While it is drying, I can apply the next transfer to it, but I also want to apply the transfer to one which is already dried. So still got some varnish on this brush, just going to paint that where I'm going to apply this. So we have our 2 miniatures just there. Just going to clean that brush, and while I'm here I'm just going to put the lid back on the varnish. So I need 2 numbers for these, so from my section there I'm going to get some number 4s. So I'll try and do it on camera so you can see. So I'm just cutting those out from this, and all I'm going to do is lay it on where I put some of that water previously, and then getting my brush, just going to drip some more water on there. Now what you will find with the newer transfers, this is a lot easier. whereas with the old ones you do have to let them soak a lot longer, especially if they are quite old and you need to kind of revive them slightly. This is why I also use the clear varnish. You're not just relying on the stickiness of the transfer, you've got another surface that helps stick the transfer down. So that first number 4, there we go, that is coming off. So here we have our number 4 on the brush, and I'm going to go to the one that was already dry, which I put a little bit of varnish on, and I'm just going to gently stick that in place. A little bit of finessing so I get it in exactly the right place, and there we go. So now I'm going to do it to the one that is not quite dry, so the previous transfer is still movable, just so you can see that you can just stick them straight on top of each other. Now I've got to take my time when I do this, because I'm adding more moisture again to the process. You can see I've moved the first one, so it is a case of gently moving them both, and it is a little bit tricky. So my general advice whenever applying transfers is take your time, let the first layer stick in place before you start moving and applying the other ones. But if you are a bit impatient, you can do it. Needs to just nudge that up slightly. There we go. Just get that into focus. Apologies if that wasn't in focus. So I can apply that next layer while I'm waiting for the first one to dry, but it can be a little bit tricky. This one that I applied, it went on nice and smoothly. What I will do with those now is I will wait for those to dry thoroughly before I apply another coat of clear varnish onto them. What I have here is one that has completely dried, and here is the one which has been slightly weathered as well. And the way I go about weathering it and dulling down the colour is I use washes or inks, and also I might use another colour that I dot in places to look like the transfer has been scraped away and so on. In this case I'm just going to use the Nuln Oil just to brush over the top of it. This takes away some of the shininess. If you want them to stay bright and shiny and with no wear, don't worry about this stage, it's fine, you can leave it. But I'm just going to gently run over it with a small amount of Nuln Oil just to knock it back slightly. If I use too much while it's still wet, I can use water to kind of clean it up. But all I want to do is run this over the top of the whole thing. There's a little bit too much on there. So I'm just going to clean my brush and draw some of that out from the edges. Just with that brush. There we go. And now I'm going to let that dry. And as I let that dry, the shininess of the transfer will get knocked back, and I'll be left with something like this that we can see on this final miniature. And that's it. That's how I start to apply transfers to my models. Today I'm going to be looking at my go-to base painting for most of my models. I use this technique to create more of a kind of a base palette to then add extra detail and that kind of thing to bases, but it's perfectly good on its own. So sometimes when I get to a stage with a model, I'll paint the base up in this style,
and then I can think about adding more details, more colours and things later on. So there's only 4 elements to the bases that I use as a kind of a go-to, and that is 2 of the texture or technical paints, the Agrellan Earth and Nastro Granite. Then have Agrax Earthshade as a wash, and then dry brushing over the top with Grey Sear or a similar paint. So I've got all of the stages here in front. If we have a look at what the first stage is going to end up looking like, we have here the Agrellan Earth, which is a kind of a broken mud, dried up mud kind of texture. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to apply that first to this Dark Angel miniature, and I apply this particular one with the texture applicator. Because it's only a small base, I'm going to use the small end. But all I do is scoop some out of the pot, and then I just move that onto the base itself. I've spilt some over the edge, so let me clean that up. And I put it in a few places on that base. Now, you can do it thickly, you can do it thinly, entirely up to you. It depends what you want to get out of the texture at the end of it. I wash that texture tool exactly the same way as I wash my brushes, as well, in a pot of water. Now I have 1 or 2 options now. I can leave this to dry naturally. Alternatively, something that I often do is force it with a hairdryer. So I have a hairdryer here, and what I'm going to do, I'm just going to hairdry. Let's move these out of the way to focus. I'm going to hairdryer this so you can watch it cracking. So as you can see, it's starting to crack around the edges. So it does this naturally anyway, but using a hairdryer does force it to do it quite quickly. So what I've now got, if I can get this in focus, we've got the cracked surface of this paint. If you leave it for just a long enough period to dry anyway, it will do this cracking anyway, but I do like to force it sometimes. But it still needs to dry at this point, it's not fully dry. Please be careful when you're using a hairdryer as well. It can get quite hot and it can distort the minis. You can also risk burning yourself, so always be careful. So the next stage, once I've got that dried on the base, I use some of the Astrogranite. There are a few other ones that I use, but this is the more kind of granulated texture is the thing that I go for with these ones. And rather than using the texture tool, I actually just paint this on with a big brush. You've got to make sure you clean the brush properly afterwards as well though. But let's just paint this texture on exactly where I want it to be. Now with the more granulated texture paints, really important to let it dry thoroughly before you do any other kind of parts to it. I found from my experience I can never get it to dry in the forced manner with a hairdryer to a nice quality, so I tend to always leave it to dry naturally. You might have better luck than me, but I found it becomes a bit too kind of rounded and smooth when I use the hairdryer, so I tend to paint this, then just leave it to dry naturally. You can make these texture paints as well. The granulated ones, you can add a little bit of sand or sawdust to a chosen paint to create that texture, so don't feel you have to use the ones that Games Workshop produce, and there's loads of other ones that are made. But as I've got them, that's why I'm using them. So, once I've got to that stage, we end up with a base looking like this. And what I do at this point is I tie both of these colours together, or whichever ones that I've used. And I do that with some Agrax Earthshade. Now you'll hear a little noise as I shake that. I've actually put a ball bearing into this so it mixes up a bit better in the pot. Personal preference, I tend to like using the Games Workshop pots. Other people like using droppers or decanting them into other things. Entirely up to you. But all I'm going to do with the Earthshade is get a generous amount on my brush, and then I'm just going to paint this over the base itself. And at this point, it doesn't matter if I get any of this on the lower sections of the foot or the model. It'll add to a little bit of weathering from the ground itself. But the key thing when you are applying this layer is the previous ones have to be dry. So you might need a little bit of patience. If they're not dry, what tends to happen is you start to move that colour around on the base, and it can kind of ruin the base a little bit, and you might have to redo certain parts. But once that's on in place, we just want to set that back to dry. And then once it's dry, it'll have that even shade across the whole thing. The next step is some dry brushing. I'm going to use some grey cere, but you can use pretty much any colour that you want for this. I have in the past used a green to get a more grass-like texture or a moss-like texture, but I'm just going to use the grey cere because I want a kind of an ashy kind of wasteland kind of look on this one. And as I dry brush this on, I try to be careful not to get it on the feet, but if it does go on the feet, similar to the wash, doesn't matter because it just adds that little bit of weathering to the model itself, so it looks like it's kicked up a bit of dust and so on. This dry brush is getting a little bit worse for wear. I should take better care of my brushes. So at that point, you can see we've dry brushed over the whole top of the surface. Let's look at the sergeant of the squad so you can see that base there. Now at this point, the final thing I do whenever I paint my miniatures or when I've finished doing the bases is I'll repaint the rim of the base itself. I like to go for a black rim around the edge. Whatever colour suits you, doesn't really matter. But what I can do at this point is then either do some more ink washes and some more dry brushes and so on to kind of make more depth and so on. But this is my go-to base to start with this process.
Today I'm going to be converting a Ravenwing character for my 10th edition Warhammer 40,000 Dark Angel army. Now, what I wanted to do was create a character out of some of the spare Outrider kits that I've got. Got 2 bikes spare out of other projects that I've done. And looking at the new rules,
I've decided on, in-game, this being a Space Marine captain on a bike, but in my own lore it's going to be an individual Ravenwing Outrider or something like that. So I've got a few parts from a few different kits that I've already started preparing. Obviously I've got the main body of the bike from the Outrider kit, the fairings, exhausts and legs, backpack, a body. Then I've got other parts from a few other kits. So I've got one of the helmets from the Raven Guard kit, which I'm going to use. I've got a few parts from the various Dark Angel sprues. So I've got a shield, I've got some iconography, shoulder pad. Then I've also got a arm from the Infiltrators unit. Now I'm going to use this arm, I'm going to trim off the weapon from this. I'm not 100% sure what I want this character to have. In the rules, I'm tempted with either an Inferno pistol or a combi weapon, but I haven't decided. But that won't stop me doing the conversion yet. So what I want to do to begin with is start by sorting out the rider themselves. So let's get to it. So because I've got this arm in particular, I can chop off the arm from the character. So I'm just going to do this cleanly with some snips and then tidy it up with my scalpel. Always be careful when using a scalpel, or any tool for that matter. Okay, that'll fit on there. Right, let's trim off this bolt gun from this hand. I could use the snips, but it might damage the hand slightly, so I'm just going to use my scalpel to just gently push into that from that side, and then the same from this side, and there we go. That is that bolt gun removed. Just tidy that up slightly. So there is that hand there. I have the shoulder pad as well that I'm going to want to include. The head there, this head was on another kit, which is why you can see glue marks and things on it. Got the backpack, and I've already started working on the body there. So first things first, I think I'm going to position the body on the bike itself so then I can sort this arm out correctly. So let's get started with a little bit of gluing and see where it goes. Okay, so there we have the rider completed, apart from whatever weapon that I'm going to give them. One thing that I do know I want to give them is I want to mount this combat shield over their holster, which appears on the left hand side. So what I'll do is I'll mount this side, well, I'll mount both sides of the fairings and the legs in place, and then I'll start on some of those extra details. So let's start putting those together. So, the details I want to put on this, we've got the shield I want to mount on the side of the character over the holster. I've got a Ravenwing kind of back banner that needs to go on, and then I have a Ravenwing badge for this side of the bike fairing, and then on this side I've got a Dark Angel chapter badge that I want to add to it. So let's start by editing all of the items so they fit perfectly, starting with the shield itself. It's currently mounted on an arm, so I'm going to have to clip that off and tidy it up. Okay, there's the shield done. I don't need to do anything to the Ravenwing icon, but I do need to adjust the Dark Angel chapter symbol and the back banner. So I'll start with the chapter symbol. This originally was designed to go on a backpack, so I've just got to chop the stalk off the back and the bottom so it will fit onto the bike itself. So there is the chapter badge done. Now with the back banner, I want it to actually be sweeping backwards on the bike rather than sitting upright. I don't think it looks that good that way, so I want to bring it back at this angle. So to fit it onto this bike, I'm just going to need to shave some of the bottom off. I need to make sure I do this correctly, because if it's the wrong angle in both directions, it'll be skew. There we go. Okay, so I want to start sticking these on now. So I'm going to start with the iconography. Let's get this in the middle of the fairing there. So now I've got the Ravenwing iconography on the right hand side of the bike and the left hand side on the rider's shoulders. And now the Dark Angel chapter symbol, I want to put it on this side of the fairing. So I know they don't always have the Dark Angel's chapter symbol on the Ravenwing models, but I want to have this one on this one because I want to paint this side of the fairing, this panel, Dark Angel's green with the detail on it, so it breaks up the black of the whole Ravenwing model. Okay, so there's the chapter symbol on that side, Ravenwing symbol on that side, and I'll stick the back banner on last. I just want to see how this shield positions. So I want to kind of position it just there. There's not much to glue it on. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to get a little bit of green stuff and I'm going to make a little ball that I can put behind it, and then stick that to the character. So let me just hold this in place where I want it to go. It's quite tricky in the position it is. Yeah, so I want it to kind of go like that. So I'm not going to see the green stuff that I put on. But let's see what it does when I push it into place and squidge it down. Oops. There we go. Let's get that in focus. Yeah, I'm happy with that in there. Might twist it a little bit. Yeah, there we go. Okay. Yeah, I'm happy with that mounted on the side like that. Now looking down from this angle, I can see a little bit of the green stuff.
So what I'm going to do with a sculpting tool is just get down in there and flatten it off. But I want to get the right tool. That's the one I want. I want to use this one to just push that down there. It's going to be okay because you're not going to see it because of the black colour of the Ravenwing, but that just tidies it up a little bit. Okay, cool. So the next job, I'm going to glue that back banner in place. There we go. So there are mould lines and a few bits and pieces I do need to tidy up on this, but I'm not going to worry right now. I'll do that when all of the glue's dried and everything like that. So now I have a little bit of green stuff left, and I have a base that the bike is sitting on, and I will want to put some texture and things like that on it, but I've done this in a previous video where I've put green stuff out and rolled a tyre along it to get tyre tracks. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to carefully lift this off the base, and I'm going to put the green stuff onto the base like this. And also near the front tyre as well. So I've got two little patches of green stuff there, and I do have a wheel from the ATV, which, although it's slightly bigger, it's got the same tread on it, and what I want to do is just roll that across the green stuff. So it's given me, show that to camera, a little bit of tread on the sides, and I'm just going to use my scalpel just to smooth out the edges a little bit. But what this will give is just that extra little bit of detail to the base when I come to texture it. So let's put that back in here. So although you don't really see it at the front, you do see it on the back, which works quite nicely, I think. Okay, so while I decide what weapon this guy wants to have, I'm going to call it there for this video. Today we're going to be having a look at my Dark Angel's Ravenwing Outrider conversion. I completed it a little while ago and promptly painted it, but I didn't make a video of the painting process, so that's what I'm doing now. I'm just going to talk about the processes that I used and let you have a good look at this model. Any videos relating to this, so applying transfers or creating the base and that kind of thing, I'll leave some links in the description so you can watch those videos as well, because I've gone through my basic techniques for this. But to start with, let's have a look at the model as a whole. Obviously it's Ravenwing, so it's going to be black in colour. I have made a video in the past on painting black a certain way using a white base, but this time round I used black as a base. So I actually used some Chaos Black primer as the base. Alternatively, I could have used a Baden Black. The next stage was giving a dry brush of Skaven Blight Dinge, which followed with a wash of Null Oil. I then did two other dry brushes on top of that, one being the Mechanicus Standard Grey, and then in places followed by some Grey Sear. Now if you'd like me to do a very specific video on painting that black, I'd be happy to. Just drop a like and a comment. But it created a finish that I was really happy with. A few other little details on here, so
around the Dark Angels chapter badge, I did actually use some green to have a kind of a halo around it of a slightly different colour that picks up on some lighting. I also played around with heated metal effects for the exhausts. So again, if you'd like to see how I do that, drop a comment. And then other than that, it was applying transfers. So the transfers that I applied, I have a veteran's symbol on the right shoulder pad. I have some marksman transfers just on the side of the bike there. I then have that checkerboard pattern, which really enjoyed putting in place, adds a real nice bit of detail to this piece. And as well as that, on the little screen I used a transfer. Let's get that in focus. I used a transfer and then painted over it with a few layers of washes and varnish and things to make it look like the screen had certain details on it. But I really enjoyed painting this one up. It took me probably about 4 or 5 hours in total to complete this paint job. Obviously when I'm doing individual pieces it does take longer than if I'm batch painting. But yeah, I really enjoyed this. Now in the game, when I started converting this, I was looking at a captain on a bike, which is why this one's armed with an Inferno pistol. But since the release of the Space Marines Codex, it's no longer in the Codex, that kind of character, but it is available on the downloads of the Games Workshop website under the Adeptus Astartes, where you can still get some of the older units. I'm still going to use it as a captain on a bike because I just have one of them. I haven't got any other models at the moment that can be part of a squad, so I'm going to leave it at that for now. I hope you've enjoyed this compilation video. If there's anything you'd like me to go through in more detail, or you've got any video suggestions, please drop it in the comments. If you've liked the video, please drop a like. But for now, thank you for tuning in. My name's John, and you've been watching War Games, Models, and Other Hobbies.